It's wonderful to see how many of you have joined us today for the Thinking Through the Museum workshop on child-centered approaches in museology. Alex Robichaux is our project coordinator, and she will be assisting us by sharing links and providing technical assistance, which is just a small part of what she does to keep the Thinking Through the Museum project going. If you're interested to learn more about this international research network, Alex will be putting a link in the chat. I encourage you to check out our website and also to sign up for our newsletter. We're always looking for new possibilities, new partners, new collaborations. So if you have ideas and if you would like to learn more about what we're doing, please don't hesitate to reach out. So unfortunately, we don't have time for individual introductions, but we do encourage you to say who you are and where you're joining us from through the chat if you'd like. Rebecca and I are both in Ottawa, Canada, which is located within the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And with deep gratitude, we wish to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are our hosts and our ongoing responsibilities to all forms of life in these lands and waters. If you're not sure what Indigenous territory you are currently on, you can consult the nativeland.ca website by putting in your location, and it's a really great resource to learn more about the history of the place or the places that you inhabit. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Monica Eileen Patterson. I am an associate professor of childhood and youth studies, and also the assistant director of the graduate program in curatorial studies at Carleton University. And I'll hand it over to Rebecca to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I am a PhD candidate in public history at Carleton University in Ottawa, working under Monica. And I'm also a research assistant on the Children's Museology cluster, which is part of the Thinking Through the Museum project.
Great. So we're going to jump into things. Our talk is on child-centered approaches in museology. And I think a good place to start is thinking about where children often start as they enter museums. So if you are a child coming to visit a museum, chances are this is one of the first things you encounter as you cross that threshold in some way. So what you see on the left is a more kind of draconian version with lots of visual cues about what is mainly not allowed. And then there's a more sort of child-friendly version on the right of museum rules. But still, when you look closely, there's lots of bold and capital and underlined phrases, most of which start with the command, do not. So when children come into museums, they're typically barraged with a set of constraints. And I think more importantly, a kind of tone that I think we could all agree is probably not the most welcoming. So whether they're coming with a family member or with friends in a small group or on an organized field trip with a school or community group, they're often having that experience really heavily framed by a kind of disciplining approach about what they cannot do and what they shouldn't do. Now, this isn't to say that we believe or we would endorse children kind of creating havoc and being destructive in these museum spaces. We understand that there are very fragile and valuable and important things in museums, and we are very committed to preserving these items and their longevity, but it's sort of an opening premise or provocation, if you will, to think about how we might do things a little differently. So in the next slide, I have a really basic question, and I'd like everyone to just take a moment. If you'd like to jot down some notes, this is going to be a workshop. So the first half of our time together will be Rebecca and I going through some key ideas. But in the latter half, we're really going to try and get you talking to each other and sharing thoughts and resources. So where are children in museums? And if anyone feels like putting some things in the chat, you can feel free to do that. A lot of times when I first tell people about my own research, which is attempting to forge a new critical field of children's museology, they say, "Oh, okay, right. You work in children's museums." And I do not usually work in children's museums. This is obviously a robust and important part of the museological infrastructure in the world. But children's museums, in my view, are very good examples of what I would call child-friendly places. So these are spaces that are welcoming to children. They are often catered to children's needs and the things they like, and many of them do a great job at providing children with really cool stuff. However, they're rarely designed with or by children. Children are rarely contributing to the actual content and programming in these museums in the ways that I'm most interested in. So this is really the key kernel of the conversation that we're going to have in this workshop, is trying to carve out a distinction between what we think of when we think of child-friendly versus child-centered approaches. So in the next slide, I've given you an example of what is one of the most common workshops available for children in art museums and art galleries. And this is a workshop format, typically on Saturdays. And so what you see in these kinds of events is that children are taught about usually a white male European master. And that's a very revealing word, I think, right? Because it's so embedded, and there's so much sort of embedded in this term that points to the way that we're thinking about, in this case, art, um, and about how children are being presented with this knowledge. So the workshop will typically introduce a specific artist, perhaps with some biographical information, uh, some rather didactic, typically instruction on their style and technique. And then they are invited usually to emulate that artist and try to copy them. So as you can see here, you see several smiling children holding their own works of very similar renditions of some of Monet's garden pieces. In the next slide, you'll see an example as well. So on the left, this is sort of an extreme version. So if we think about the difference between, say, a coloring book or a coloring page that's provided, and with this one, you actually can look closely and see the child is being instructed on what colors to fill in these different blocks, right? So there's very little space for their own choice and agency and creativity. Versus on the right, that's a picture of my own child in the Museum of Childhood in Cape Town, South Africa, where they have a huge, in part open air studio space with lots of different materials, workspaces. And what you cannot probably see so clearly on that wall is a range of very original creative works by child artists who have come in and they've done what they want. So when my child was in this space, she created a lot of things that I had never sort of seen before, and I had never seen from her before, because she was inspired in the moment by the possibilities, the unfettered possibilities. So this is the distinction that we're really hoping to explore.
As Monica was trying to were starting to point to in those two examples, we want to spend just a little bit of time really trying to define what we mean by child-friendly versus child-centered, and especially when it comes to museum practice. And there are a lot of overlaps between those two terms, but we're thinking of them in two specific ways. So on our end, we're thinking of child-friendly as meaning something that is typically created for the child, primarily designed to be something that is entertaining or maybe educational, and the instructions typically flow in a unidirectional fashion. So from an adult to a child, whether that's the educational components that they're trying to teach or directions for an activity. Um, Meanwhile, in our conception of this term, child-centered would be something that involves an activity or a program, something that's created with or by the child themselves. In this context, the child takes a bigger lead in designing exactly what they want to see as the output. Adults are there, certainly, but more so as facilitators than leaders or directors. And in this case, information or instructions or design approaches flow in a much more unidirectional fashion. And so part of kind of the purpose of this workshop is to define child-centered museology. And we're going to be offering some examples in later slides. And we also want to show kind of where this idea is coming from, what the line of thinking this is coming out of. And ultimately, what we want to kind of impart is that child-centered museum practice really provides young people with more agency over how they are engaged or represented and welcomed into museum spaces. So using the examples that Monica provided before, children's museums are incredibly child-friendly spaces. They're engaging, they're entertaining, and they're often educational as well, but they're not always child-centered. Here's kind of where the idea of children's museology stems from. And this is really the goal or the thesis of today's workshop, some of these questions that we're posing. So if museology encompasses the study and the practice of museum work, we're asking how this might change if children were included not just as subjects or target audience members or target visitors, but also as active participants and co-creators of museum content and programming behind the scenes. And we ask as well, kind of what might a child-centered approach where there's sharing of power with children and they're recognized as valuable contributors in museum spaces, as cultural producers, and as knowledge bearers, what might that look like if we were to recognize children as all of those things in museum spaces or other cultural institutions? And lastly, kind of on the flip side, we can also ask how might children use curatorial practices or curatorial strategies as a way of maybe sharing or elevating their knowledge, their perspectives, and their cultural productions with broader publics. So these are all kind of the questions that we want to be mulling over throughout this workshop.
So what Rebecca and I see as the incredible potential of this current moment for a new kind of children's museology is really emerging out of many decades worth of activism, advocacy, scholarship, and intervention by children themselves in different ways. So this is a complex history. It varies quite a bit from place to place. And of course, it's hugely impacted by a lot of different social factors such as class, race, gender, sexuality, location. However, I think there are three general paradigms that we can point to that have shifted the terrain for how museums might be thinking about children and what the promises are in what lays ahead. So rooted very much in an academic context, in the early 1990s, we saw the new social studies of childhood. And this is a kind of movement that was articulated by a set of mainly sociologists based in the UK, but also some historians and anthropologists, geographers, scholars mainly in the social sciences, who made a kind of declaration about this new approach to thinking about children and also studying children and childhood. So this is a sort of quick distillation of their key arguments. And it was coming out of a history of seeing children as unimportant, incomplete, and immature. So, in other words, children have typically been seen throughout history in terms of what they lack. So they're kind of defined by the shortcomings that need fixing, either through education, discipline, socialization, or experience. And children have been and still often are treated often as blank screens upon which adults cast their own values, hopes, and fears. So the scholars of the new social studies of childhood asserted that childhood is socially constructed. So this means that it's not a fixed or universal concept or experience, but it's shaped by cultural, social, and historical factors. Children have agency. This is really important. Children have always had agency, but I think the main challenge lies in recognizing and making space for them to act more upon their agency. They are active participants in society who make choices and take actions that impact the world in a multitude of ways. As Rebecca will describe shortly, children also have rights and should have a say in the things that affect them, just as adults do. And they're not just little adults. They have their own ways of thinking, feeling, and seeing the world. So there are a lot of things that are unique to, of course, specific individual children, but also to children more broadly. Finally, these scholars insisted that children are knowledge holders and knowledge producers. So this is sort of where we are today, certainly in the field of child studies, which is a critical interdisciplinary field. And I think that the change that this group of scholars enacted can best be summarized by a shift from thinking about doing research on children to doing research with children. So you'll hear among child studies scholars that I don't think there's any of us who would still say, oh, I'm doing research on children. It's really trying to think differently about sharing authority, making space for children's agency, recognizing their knowledge and contributions, to partner with them in our research and learning.
The second kind of paradigm shift that we are drawing from in terms of the lineage of where children's museology is stemming from is really the children's rights movement. So there's a long history of children's rights being recognized, kind of usually placed around the beginning of the 20th century with the Geneva Declaration in 1924 that stated that humanity owes to the child the best that it has to give and outlined some fundamental needs of the child. The children's rights movement really solidified around the 1980s, specifically with the introduction of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. And the UNCRC really set out this kind of civil, political, economical, social, health, and cultural rights of children. And within the context of this document, they're just defined as those under the age of 18. So there are 54 articles with many different sub-articles, and it's a really lengthy document. But everything kind of falls under the three P's as they're often described. So protection, and that means protection from violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, and discrimination. The other P being provision, so being provided with access to education, healthcare, food, shelter, and other essential needs. And then maybe most importantly for our purposes in the museum world, the third P being participation. So specifically, children are said to have the right to express their views and opinions and to be actively involved in decisions that concern their lives. So such as things related to education, healthcare, and community development. And we're kind of extending that to culture as well. Instead of going, I guess, over all 54 articles of the UNCRC, we've kind of pulled out three that directly apply to what we're trying to do with children's museology. So we have Article 12, which relates to participation. So states parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express views freely in all matters affecting the child, the views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. And of course, it becomes a little hard to distinguish or define, like, what are the things that really affect the child, and how do you distinguish between maturity? How do you define maturity? Because that is, of course, a cultural construct. But just kind of the overall goal of allowing children a say in things that are being provided to them or that concern them in their daily lives. Article 13 and also kind of pertains to participation, sharing how the child shall have the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of speak, either orally, writing, and print. So again, thinking about how kids can be more involved as participants in the decision making that goes into museum offerings that are designed for them or that their families will be going to, or even more broadly conceived than that. And lastly, the UNCRC also defines how children have a right to culture. So it states that states parties shall respect and promote the right of the child to participate fully in cultural and artistic life and shall encourage the provision of appropriate and equal opportunities for cultural, artistic, recreational, and leisure activities. So these are just kind of three of the ones that we wanted to point to in terms of where our thinking is coming from a rights-based perspective. And of course, the language that's being used and was introduced in 1989 when this was first drafted and ratified by many countries is now quite dated. So you're seeing things like a gender binary where it speaks about boys and girls in a lot of the language. And also, it's very hard to define, and like many UN documents are also quite hard to implement evenly across the board. So we have to ask questions like what counts as mattering to the child, what counts as being given due weight or maturity. And it's presented from a very kind of objective, shared experience of childhood that we know varies across geographic space, cultural space, class-based space, etc. So while some of the language might still be dated and clunky around here, it's also hard to see how many of these ideas have been implemented meaningfully. So children are still not granted as much access to participation in matters that concern them, I think, that as we would like to see.
So the third big paradigm shift that we think is really relevant for laying some important groundwork for new possibilities with children is in the kind of overlapping and intersecting fields or calls for critical museology and new museology. So we thought we might tap into the room, as it were, and see what folks here associate with these new developments. And so if you have, I guess, adjectives or nouns and you'd like to just type them into the chat, what do you think of when you think about new museology or when you think about critical museology? And we'll just take a couple minutes here to see what you come up with. Inquiry-based learning, that's a good one. Co-curation or co-creation, collaborative, engaged, community allied, feeling free, reflexive, decolonizing, democratizing, community, open exploration, reformulating the relationship of museums to communities, transparency, questions about objects' provenance, redressing founder narratives, repatriation, a shift away from the museum practitioner as expert and moving toward a space of sharing, both tangible and intangible culture, integration of different ways of knowing and learning styles, and partnership. Yeah, so this is a fabulous list, and there's so much overlap in this list, and there's also a lot of really different things. So we can take a look at some of the words that we came up with. You'll see a lot of resonance here. We talked about the shift to more democratic museum practice. Accessibility is a big issue, and we can think of that in many different ways, including people with disabilities, but also thinking about generation, class, culture, multivocality has been embraced by many in these movements, thinking more about the different senses. So the hegemony of the visual has been noted by a lot of museum scholars, but we have other senses as well that can be engaged in museums. Inclusivity, inclusion, being more inclusive, sharing authority, being more dialogic, participatory, diverse, decolonizing, and community engagement. So we could probably go on and flesh this out even more, but you see, even if we're coming from different kinds of museological practice, if we're coming from different disciplines, there is a kind of core set of values and of goals that I think fit in really well with the possible roles for children to play in museums. So some of these things like being participatory, having dialogue, multivocality, attending to the senses. These are things that children actually excel in, not in every single case or in a kind of uniform way, but there's a lot that children could contribute if given the opportunity, in terms of the values we've just identified as part of new museology. So these movements are overlapping, and maybe we should have started here, but they come together, I think, because they're based on a critique of traditional museum practices and also a desire for social change. So questions of historical injustice, contemporary ongoing injustice, and of course the legacies of the past are really central to this work. And we are thinking a lot about power, about bias and inequality within museums and their reputations. Then similarly, new museology is working to make museums more inclusive and participatory, recognizing that audiences are and should be very diverse. And then a lot of the work that many of us are engaged in around communities, collaboration, and dialogue is central to this transformative work. So in what follows, in what follows now, I think that we will just, or I guess I can offer a idea about what the new critical children's museology might be. And as I've been thinking of this over the past several years, I think children's museology can be about the production of museum content and programming that's not just for or about children, also important, but trying to widen that sphere of possibility for content and programming by and with children. And by doing so, we can engage with them as valued social actors and knowledge bearers. So now I'd like to go through a few concrete examples because, we're sort of tacking between some very abstract ideas, and we've tried to give a very quick historical context, But now we'd like to jump into some specific examples before we break, and then we hear from you about your own examples and challenges.
There we go. So the first kind of child-centered museum practice that we want to focus on is in collecting initiatives and in collections more broadly. So we're thinking here about how museums could target children and young people in a contemporary aspect, but also in terms of like historical material culture and archival documents and what have you. But really thinking about children's productions as cultural production and something that a museum could value and see value in collecting, and not just material culture, of course, but also something along the lines of intangible culture, so capturing maybe children's folklore or interviews with young people related to things that matter to them in their daily lives. And just one kind of specific example that we'll touch on are all of the COVID collecting initiatives that targeted children. So Monica and I wrote an article about this, but several museums across Canada, across the world, really, in that period of early 2020, when everyone was at home thinking about like how are museums going to remember this moment moving forward, children were often considered as a specific collections target. So they were asked to share with museums examples of their rainbow drawings, for example. We have here a workbook that was prepared by the Niagara on the Lake Museum in Ontario called My COVID-19 Journal. That was specifically meant for young people to fill out about their experiences of COVID. And it had a lot of different kind of creative ways of capturing those experiences. So not only in the written form, but also in comic strips like you see on this slide. So this was just kind of one example where museums considered young people as a population that was worthy of having their experiences of this really unprecedented moment remembered for posterity purposes. And kind of along that same line as well, there are multiple museums that are popping up that are specifically dedicated to collecting children's artwork specifically. So here we have the International Museum of Children's Art in Oslo, Norway. There's also a Museum of Children's Art in New York City. And these museums do a really great job of presenting children's art in the same way that you would think to present the artwork of an adult or a quote unquote capital A artist. So framed on the wall with labels and didactics. And it's just kind of one example of how children's collections can be elevated in museum spaces.
Another area for children's contribution that we've identified is in terms of interpretation. The unadulterated audio tour hack is at this point sort of an old example, but sadly there haven't been a ton of others that have come across my radar that I can point to. This was sponsored by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2011. And in this project, museum educators worked with a group of children to revisit and explore their perspectives on some of the works from their permanent collection. So a audio tour was created with very high production quality. They spent a lot of money on this and put in a lot of time. And what you can hear, if you'd like to click through later to the link, is some short video, audio segments. I guess there are also some accompanying videos on YouTube where you hear child interpreters talking about the works in front of them. So they range from sort of playful and joking to more substantive. And what you can hear when you listen to these is a lot of the same types of questions that are posed by art historians to artwork. It's also just kind of a fresh and different way to think about a core exhibit of works and a permanent collection. So these perspectives are not often heard. One thing that I'll mention that's very clear with this project and others like it is without knowing the exact background of the child participants, to the eye, it looks like a very homogeneous group. So I think that often when opportunities like this arise, it's important to ask who are the children who are being reached, who are being invited, and who have the means to participate. So what you see with the unadulterated audio tour hack is what looks like, I think, mainly white children, um, probably who are already pretty museum literate in a lot of ways, so already having the privilege of spending time in museum spaces. And this is one of the big challenges that I face in my work as well. It's trying to break down some of these inequalities so that museums and children's participation in them is not reserved just for that same elite small circle of privileged kids. A second area of potential contribution that is popping up with increasing frequency around the world is in programming. So one example I can point to is the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh in the United States, where they have a Youth Alive after school program. So this is with youth. You see a lot of the programs that are similar to this are targeting that slightly older age group, which is really great and important. But this is a group of teenagers who are involved in developing and leading interactive exhibits and workshops for younger visitors. So you see a kind of intergenerational conversation happening there that's maybe not quite generational, but across different age groups. So there's been a lot of scholarship from people studying children and how they learn that has pointed to the value of mixing up different ages. And perhaps contrary to what you might think at first, it's not only the younger children who learn from the older children, but there's a lot of mutual learning that happens that's beyond what would take place in more limited age groups. So younger children are learning from older children and from one another, but older children are also learning and acquiring or developing skills as they engage with their younger peers. So there's lots of possibilities here for involving youth in programming, but basically trying to figure out what children and youth think museums should do for their activities is a great place to start. They have lots of good creative ideas, and young people are pretty good at throwing a party or creating an event. So one of the big challenges for those of us trying to study this work is that it's often rendered kind of invisible and ephemeral. So I love this project because they also have an online blog where young contributors are invited to post. They can write about different topics of their choosing. So it's a good example for me of a project that seems to have taken as much opportunity as possible for letting young people be the decision makers um, whenever they can. And I think there's a tremendous amount of potential there. I think a project like this is relevant to any and every museum and gallery in the world in some way. I think every institution could benefit from taking seriously the perspectives of young people.
Another area where young people's perspectives are definitely greatly valued, and some specific examples of that is in kind of design. So whether that's for a brand new museum or a specific exhibit or a specific didactic installation, what have you. One example that we've pulled out is the Canadian Museum of History's Reimagining the Children's Museum project, where there was a day-long kind of booked out day of activities at the Children's Museum where young people and their families were invited to come and share their perspectives for what they wanted to see for the future of the Canadian Children's Museum. So there are a bunch of activities laid out for everyone, which included making kind of little shoebox versions of their ideal museum that had things from like slides going down through them to trampolines and what have you. And one really innovative, but simple, but innovative activity that they had set up for kids there was an illustrator who was in live time drawing out children's kind of verbal explanations of what they wanted to see in the future museum, where everyone could see the kind of elevated depictions of these really creative imaginings of what the museum could look like, done by a professional illustrator that really sought to capture all of the minutiae of what they wanted to see. And so this is just kind of one example of how young people can be adding and contributing to design ideas. And in this case, it's for an exhibit or for a museum that really concerned them as a primary audience. So of course, it makes the most sense to have young people who are going to be the primary visitors of this space be the ones to help shape what the future of that space looks like. And kind of similarly at the Young V&A Museum of Childhood, which I had the privilege of going to in 2020, right before the pandemic, when they were doing their reconfiguration of the Museum of Childhood, also had like a lot of setups for children to impart their own perspectives on what they wanted to see in that space. There are a lot of testing areas for certain objects that were more resonant to children, for them to vote on which object they wanted to see represented in the space. A lot of different creative and very child-friendly spaces for them to artistically render images of the museums that they wanted to potentially see in the future. So again, it's just a really great opportunity when thinking about redesigning a space or designing a new space, whether or not children are considered the primary target audience of that space. Regardless of that, often children come into more typically deemed like adult spaces in museums with their families and with school groups or what have you, and their wisdom and their kind of hopes and wants for museum spaces could also be super valuable in those cases as well. Another area would also be in kind of governance and operations, and this kind of falls in line with what Monica was talking about programming initiatives. Here specifically, we're thinking of youth councils, and there are plenty of examples of museums that have youth councils around the world. We've kind of pointed to the Museum London Youth Council that targets young people between the ages of 14 and 19 to share their opinions on the museum's developments, their new exhibitions, things like that. And so it's another great example of young people really being kind of elevated to a governance level and being offered the opportunity to share perspectives of what their age cohort would want to see in museum spaces. Similarly, at the Museum of Solutions, MUSO, in Mumbai, India, they have a children's panel where 20 children from schools all over Mumbai are targeted to meet once a month and provide museum staff with feedback on different aspects of the museum. And then their feedback is incorporated into the design and the content of the museum. So another kind of example of how young people could be included in more like governance strategies.
So I'll divert for just a moment to share something about a recent trip that I had to Sweden where I was talking about this work. And one of the people in the audience asked me if this project of children's museology was merely a political project or something more. And I didn't really understand the question. I asked for a rephrase, but what this person was asking was, is this work really just about including children for the sake of including them? Or do they actually have something substantive and valuable to offer? My response to that was, mainly we don't really know yet, as there have been so few contexts where children are engaged as potential contributors. The overwhelming approach is to view them as receivers that need education or entertainment or containment. But I think one of the areas that I can point to where I think without question children really can sort of stand up to the interrogation and the evaluation that comes from the sometimes elite and snooty museum world is when they're given the chance to curate. I think it's true for all of the other domains before this one as well. And there are some really significant differences in museum types. So the way that children might be valued or visible, or the way that their cultural production may or may not be collected is really different in, say, a history museum than it is in, for instance, an art gallery. But I think that for art galleries, while some might balk at including children's works as contributing artists, a way to involve them is to invite them to curate exhibits. So one example that came up during COVID, when a lot of the museums were closed, was the Museum of Liverpool's My Home is My Museum initiative. And in this project, children were invited to curate small exhibits of their own personal belongings at home. So they selected and assembled specific things into a mini exhibit that they then titled and thought about and shared with the world virtually in some way as an assembled set of things. And this project I thought was profoundly insightful. It provided an eye into the very unprecedented experience of this global pandemic and the ensuing lockdown. And it gave us a sense of these people as individuals, but also as members of society, struggling with similar issues, and sharing their contributions. The next project that I'll talk you through very quickly is also a project I find incredibly powerful. It happened at the National Museum in Warsaw in 2016. I've talked a lot about this project because it remains the best example that I can point to of what's possible when we let children curate exhibits. So in this project, it was a very substantial project. So there were 69 child curators who worked on Saturdays over a period of about 5 months. So it was a major commitment. It was very well funded by the museum. And they were given prime real estate space. They were not stuck in some side or basement gallery, but they were exhibiting really essentially 6 different sort of mini exhibits in the ground floor of this museum, drawing from the permanent collection. So the 6 exhibits ranged in topic and in approach. And in the next slide, I can show you. I'll just take you through a couple quick examples. So this one is from a mini exhibit that was called The Forest. And what you see here is in some ways quite traditional. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that children and their involvement will not definitely produce the most groundbreaking, unprecedented, amazing thing ever. There's also a lot of kind of derivative things that happen. Children are also imitating one another and others in the world. Their works can be different degrees of compelling. So this one was sort of traditional in some ways. They found works that portrayed different animals that you might find in the forest. But if we think back to those keywords we generated collectively, describing new museology and critical museology, you can see here that they were thinking about the senses. So they actually chose an oil painting depicting a forest that was then reproduced and blown up and then put on the wall to really try to get a sense of being in this kind of space. They wanted dim lighting. They wanted sound, so you can hear ambient bird song and the sound of being in a forest as you go through and look at some of these works. The next slide shows one of the other exhibits that was a re-exploration of the ancient Greek story of the Minotaur. And so they found different works that they wanted to share with the public. And in the gallery space, they worked with obviously adult designers to render their labyrinthine gallery space. So what you can see here a bit from the slide is that visitors had to navigate through this maze, sort of replicating the experience of going through this labyrinth. They also wanted to create a movie. So in the top of that image, you can see this triptych movie that came from, this was their idea, to have three different images and three different kind of tracks going simultaneously. They wrote the script, they designed the costumes, they acted in the play. And interestingly, they wanted to shoot this film in a lot of the spaces that were not accessible to the general public. So they were quite fascinated with the back storage rooms and the kind of unallowed spaces that most people could not visit. Interestingly, also is their attention to power and to access and to equality. So they recognized that they had a lot of privilege and they were being allowed to go into this collection holdings and into these closed off rooms. And they wanted to share that experience with visitors. The next slide shows another of these exhibits, which was called Ghost Room. So this one was my favorite. In this room, you see a very creative approach to developing a false narrative. So they imagined that these works were owned by a single, as they called him, mad collector. So they told the audience that they were seeing some remnants from this world traveler who had come to ill demise. And the works they chose were many that had never been exhibited before. They were very dark, dealt with a lot of difficult, grisly content. So not all of their ideas were allowed. The painting in the foreground of the zombie, they wanted to have printed out as a bed cover, so you could go to the gift shop and buy it and have it as your comforter. So the adults in charge nixed that idea. They also wanted to hang some furniture from the ceiling. That was also vetoed because it was considered too dangerous to the objects and potentially the visitors. But in the next slide, you'll see an innovation that I think is really worth thinking about that comes from this room. So the goal of the curators of the Ghost Room was to scare their visitors a little, but they wanted them to emerge from this experience a little bit braver. So what they designed, as I mentioned, contained a lot of kind of scary material, and they recognized that some of their visitors might be better enabled to handle that material, and they're very attentive to visitors who might be scared, especially younger children. So they developed, what can only be considered a curatorial technology, and in what you see here, it's a kind of scary. It's a reproduction of a scary etching of a flying skeleton, and they decided to cover that with a sort of plastic covering of hair. And so you could choose to move that to the side if you were feeling brave enough and wanted to take a peek underneath. So how to deal with difficult knowledge, how to deal with challenging content, especially with diverse audiences. What do we even mean by age appropriate? And should we also be thinking about things like, experience appropriate, or how do we accommodate people's different sensitivities and triggers and challenges as visitors? I think there's some really powerful things to think with here that these children came up with, and I think that they would have a lot of ideas in other similar contexts. I think there's one more slide, if I'm not mistaken, Rebecca, here, or maybe two more. Okay, so this is from a room that was called Playing the Hero. And in this room, visitors could see works depicting a range of 32 heroes drawn from the permanent collection. So people ranging from Einstein to bullfighters to everyday heroes like firefighters, and even anti-heroes like a former Miss Poland who refused to give up her crown. And in the foreground of this image, what you see is, again, conceptualized by the child curators, but rendered in collaboration with adult designers. It is an interactive crossword puzzle that lights up. So visitors would go through this exhibit, learn about some of the figures depicted therein, and then they would essentially be kind of quizzed on what they had learned and have to answer questions about these figures to create this crossword puzzle. So when we think about active participation, when we think about dialogue, when we think about intergenerational dialogue, especially, one thing that's interesting to note about this crossword puzzle is you couldn't do it by yourself. For it to work, there had to be people on both sides. You had to sort of work together. And if you were successful as a group in solving the crossword puzzle, then a motto would appear as a kind of reward and further engagement with this exhibit. The last example I'll show you is of another curatorial innovation. This is from an exhibit on fashion called Changes. And one of the big frustrations of the child curators working on this exhibit was that they could not touch and try on the delicate and fragile costumes that were in the collection. They imagined that a lot of visitors might feel that frustration, so they developed some ways to get around that. So one of the things they did was they worked with the adult collaborators to find similar materials, so they could actually see what organza felt like to the touch. So there were little places where there were swaths of fabric you could handle. And then what you see here is a display of some costumes that were put in glass cases. And you can see that there are steps leading up to that glass case. So this was, again, designed by the child curators who wanted to allow their visitors to try on the costumes. So you could step up to the costume and sort of hold your head above the neck opening, and then someone on the other side could take your picture or just see what you look like if you were wearing that costume. And again, you see that there are 3 steps here. So they were mindful of the differences, the diversity among their visitors. They recognized that there were visitors of different heights, and they tried to accommodate those differences in a way that would lead to a more equal and active form of participation across the board. So that is a very powerful example. I've written about this exhibit. If anyone's interested to know more, I'm happy to share my article in Museum and Society with you. And I really hope to see a lot of other examples like this that I can start talking about as well, where museums can really put some resources toward seeing what children can do.
This next half is going to be a bit more like hands-on collaborative brainstorming and really thinking together about how we can put some of these child-centered museum approaches into practices, maybe going over examples and opportunities and challenges. So we're going to ask Alex in just a minute to put us all into breakout rooms. So in smaller groups, we can work on a collaborative Google Doc that I'll also ask Alex to link in the chat below. It's just kind of a space that we can use to collaboratively brainstorm and submit some ideas in response to the 3 following questions. So kind of as we were talking, we're hoping that maybe some ideas or were sparked, or some memories were sparked about some examples of child-centered museum practice that you might have observed or visited or even worked on yourselves. We also have a question about how in your own work, what kind of ways might you involve children more actively as contributors by applying some of the more child-centered approaches that we listed earlier on? And lastly, because this is not easily done, and as Monica showed with the example in Poland, sometimes projects like these require lots of money and big budgets. So just kind of, I think it would be worthwhile to take a bit of time to also brainstorm what some of the foreseeable challenges or concerns or barriers that you might see to incorporating young people more meaningfully into some of your projects moving forward. And then I'll ask that every group have someone prepared to kind of share what their group talked about when we come back. And I think we'll go into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, and then Alex can pull us all back into the main room together.
So maybe the premise is kind of takeaways from your small group discussion, and feel free to keep dropping things in. There've been a lot of great examples shared. Put things in. You can also put questions in. Who would like to go first? Sierra.
I can take a stab. It was a really lovely conversation. We were all kind of talking, just going through the questions about our own experiences more than anything else, especially visiting museums and things like that, and with different kind of reactions around who's worked with children, who's brought children on a personal level, on a professional level, all those sorts of things. But there was some really interesting discussion. A lot of it was around the third question, but to begin with, for the first one, we were kind of thinking about some of the almost living history interactions. And so that's obviously a large topic of like living history museums, but those interactions were kind of, you have that full environment that has all of the phenomenological experiences. The one that we were thinking of specifically was the tenement museum. But also, like, growing up, I went to Heritage Park, and you have the bread I had already talked about, but clearly it's really stuck with me because it's like fourth time coming up today. Then going into like the second question of how we can involve children more actively in our work, we kind of had a couple of specific examples that we were talking about, which I won't discuss here, for there weren't my examples, but also just in general, having that as like a question that we have to ask ourselves more than anything, things that aren't necessarily stuff that you immediately jump to. For me personally, this is a really interesting question, as I work around the topics of shame and guilt. And so I've actively avoided working with children for this one, but I think that there is still value in that. It's just, how do you navigate those kind of really intense, difficult topics and emotions? But then with the third one that we had a lot to kind of discuss at the end, there was just thinking about all of the different kind of backgrounds that folks bring, especially children bring, to the different engagements that you do, how you can address, people coming in with different understandings, different histories with the museum, histories personally, how you can do that in a way that like incorporates lots of different ages, but also is cognizant of all of those different variations, and kind of, I can't remember, someone said a really lovely, very fancy term, and it's skipping me, but and also how do you acknowledge and kind of remunerate that labor, which is a larger thing that's, I know, happening in museums in a wider discussion, but how do you do that for children that would be appropriate based on their age, and recognize their contributions, and also things like even legal issues if they're making content for exhibits. How does that kind of ownership work, and all that sort of stuff, to make sure that their labor is being acknowledged? So that was us.
Great. That's there's some interesting resonances with the conversation, some of the conversations I was in the other rooms. The question around difficult knowledge, and how to proceed with care and without doing harm, and in recognition of the differences. It's really tough stuff, and it's really important, I think. Could we hear from folks in another room?
I think I can share a little bit.
Yeah, that's great.
There we go. Deirdre and I and Monica, we were discussing the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. So I have not been, but both Monica and Deirdre have. So that was, excuse me, talking about how there were some great examples of like a child-centered approach in some aspects, and that it was a really huge space where you could really spend a lot of time. But there were some questions over, sorry, excuse me. There were some questions over, is it authentically child-centered? Is there some aspects that are more child-friendly? How do we sort of navigate that? Is it possible to have a blend of both? And are you trying to maybe reach a different type of child audience, depending on what exactly you're looking for and going towards? I rambled on quite a bit about the museum I work at and how truly I don't have any good examples of child-centered museology at the site that I work at. And I don't mean that in a rude way. I'm the education coordinator, so a lot of that stems from me. So it is a self-reflection. And one of the exhibits we have coming up next year is about death and dying. So really dovetails nicely from Sierra's comment about shame and guilt. And this exhibit that we're working with, I gut instinct initially said, well, good luck creating a school program based on death and dying. Like, I don't think we can do that. It'd have to be like a high school program. And when we saw the example from the Warsaw Museum of the child who had chosen sort of ghostly figures and zombies and kind of darker images, and that their focus was on, we want people to possibly feel brave as they leave, I thought, wow, children are already engaging with this topic, which was really eye-opening for me and something I should have known already, but I didn't. So it's really helped me to reframe some of my thoughts about difficult subjects. And the last thing that we talked about was the sort of a common approach to making things like teenager friendly or youth friendly is just incorporating technology. And like, that's what they're looking for. But we had a good discussion about how do we know that's what they're looking for if we don't ask? And Monica had a great point that oftentimes too, that tech interactive breaks down and then it's not working. So what do you do? And some of us are trying to avoid screens when we go to a museum or wanting to unplug in some ways. And I believe teenagers want to do that as well. And if you go to a museum and then you're bombarded by screens, is that the experience you're looking for? So I think that's a bit of a summary of what we talked about. And feel free to correct me if I missed anything.
Yeah, I thought that we really covered a lot of ground in that discussion. And I think one of the things I was thinking about in terms of the death is so many children have already experienced death in their immediate surrounds. And when we think about what we want our museum spaces to be, I think providing support and engaging with the big pressing issues in the world, you're kind of hard pressed to find something more than all of our eventual death as like one of the big things that we will all struggle with in some way. So, but yeah, it's also just to say, it is not easy at all trying to figure out what to do with that with a group of young people. So
Yeah, I think it also speaks to how kind of like things like age appropriate or maturity are really different across different circumstances. So thinking about working with a group of young people where some of them may have experienced death in their personal lives and others might not have, I think that's one of the challenges as well. And it's not a challenge that's different for working with adults in a community where everyone has different experiences that they're bringing with them, but kind of maybe reframing how we can take into account all of those differences when working with children as a specific community as well needs to be front of mind.
I think that's a great point, and I also need to remind myself that I'm coming at it from a very Scottish, English, Irish background where death is something that we don't talk about. Well, in some contexts we do, but it's not something that's discussed, and we're very isolated from it, from death. Like in my religion, we don't do open caskets. That's not something that we do. And for us, it's viewed as inappropriate to have an open casket for my faith specifically. So I have to remind myself that I'm coming at this from a very narrow perspective. And I need to consider that there are different cultural, religious attitudes towards death that may be more open and um, more open than I've been raised. So that's a good reminder for myself as well.
Maybe if there are other groups who haven't gone yet who want to share. Also, I think like Monica said, like we're open to taking Q&As during this conversation as well, but not to put anyone on the spot, but I know my group hasn't gone yet.
I can go for our group. Um, hopefully you can hear me. Sometimes my mic drops out. Um, so we talked about our work experiences. One of our group members talked about their experience with the renovation of the children's space at the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts, and how children were invited to sort of work throughout that process through interviews about their museum experiences, how they see collections, and even getting their input on what they would like to see in terms of toys within the space. And I touched a little bit about my experience working with some of our children in the summer programs at the Collingwood Museum who were involved in a local artist project. We did a mural for the town. As we are a municipal museum, we kind of go outside the museum space sometimes to work on some projects. And how for me personally, reflecting back after listening to some of our conversation earlier about how that was maybe a little not child-centered, more child-friendly. We just gave them templates and they colored them in. And in the moment, kids were commenting about how they'd like to make their own drawings. We were making chickens and how they wanted to make their own chickens, but they were forced to kind of, or not forced, sorry, that was a bad word, how they had to stick to those templates that we were given to by the local artist. So that was kind of a good lesson on kind of just listening to kids and centering them more and being more flexible with some projects that we're working on. And then sort of we ended it off. For me, this is a big one. I work at a very small museum and our resources are very limited. And a big one is space. We don't have a lot of space to do big exhibits or change our exhibits all the time. And we don't have a lot of space to sort of have kids in the museum to be able to get messy. So we have to rent spaces outside of the museum for that. So I would love to hear maybe if anyone has more examples about small museums and things that they've implemented. So yeah, I think that was it. I probably missed a few points, but
I think that did a really good job of covering what we talked about, and that idea of one of the challenges being like space and resources and budget, and how that's definitely more constrained the smaller the museum that you are. And I think, like for me, at least in my work, trying to think about how okay we engage we typically consider like engaging adults as community members like very important. And if we're working with kind of some of the tenets of new museology that we identified earlier, like this is meant to be moving towards like a dialogic process, a more democratized process. And so maybe that means like going out into communities and doing more community related events. And I think one of the things that we can be thinking about is like, okay, where are children outside in the communities? Like, where can we be engaging them in spaces that they already frequent when the space at our own museum might be a little bit more constrained? So thinking about like working with community centers, working with schools, like all of these kind of more out and in the public approaches to working with young people and gathering their thoughts and their perspectives, and maybe collaborating with them on certain projects. I think that when we think about where we're going to reach adults, there are ways that we can extend that thinking to where we're going to reach children as well.
And I was just going to add a quick comment. I think another challenge is if you are going to do this work that goes against the grain and it's interesting to me that the final question about the challenges, concerns, and barriers has way more than any of the other questions. And I think that reveals something about this work, and the fact that it is still very emergent and often can feel quite radical. But one of the things that came up both in the example from Warsaw and also in a visit that I made to the Polin Museum, that's also in Poland, was an exhibit that was there with issues around children's themes, and it featured a kind of blown up version of a children's picture book, but it was about all these big meaty issues like governance and rights and civic participation. And at the front desk, when I was trying to visit this exhibit, I was actually directed away from it because I was by myself as an adult, and the person at the front desk who was trying to be helpful said, "Oh no, you don't want to go there. That's for kids." So when we do this work that is for and especially with children, how can we ensure that it's not dismissed or kind of relegated to the side and not engaged with by adults and by mixed groups? Yeah. But are there other, maybe we can just open it up now, like if there's some questions, some comments, if anyone needs help with something in particular, there's an interesting group of people assembled here. I think Sierra and Megan should definitely talk more. So let's just open it up. You can raise your hand. I see Erica has got her hand up.
Hi, yeah, thanks for this. So, I mean, my question is a little bit one sort of context. I know it's a little bit probably idiosyncratic, but like, I guess I have a two-part question. So as you know, I work in Poland, so I just have a special interest in Polish stuff. And, you just mentioned the second one that I had in mind. So like two of at least, I think for you, what have been the high bar exhibitions like that fall somewhere within that spectrum, sort of by, with, for, maybe not for, but yeah, by, with children are in Poland. And so, I mean, part of my question is, do you have any insight into what it is about Poland that makes that compelling, possible? Like why there? And maybe I'm just missing a broader landscape and you have lots of other examples now. So that's, I can understand that. And then the other question is, I mean, particularly in that one in the National Museum, the everything goes, I think. I just wondered, because I know a little bit about that institution. I don't remember what moment that was, but it's been an institution that's sort of been tugged, from left to right and back and forth. And I was kind of wondering if you had any insight into what was it about that particular moment. I think you said it was 2011 or 2012, like that permitted so much money and resources and attention to something that I guess, really was super groundbreaking. I mean, I know other groundbreaking things that they did that seem much more politically, edgy, but this is also groundbreaking. So anyway, I just, wonder if you had more stuff to say about like why that seems to have at least have worked there. I don't want to say that it's not like all Poland all the time, but like what made those things possible, and maybe what made them difficult. I don't know. There's probably more backstory.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe I'll just jump in quickly with the first part, at least. So I mean, it's not a huge sample size. Like they were great exhibits, but two is not huge. I think I don't know. I think you could in part answer that by thinking historically. Erica, you're the one who actually told me, and you might have to correct my pronunciation here, about Janusz Korczak. Did I say that right?
Janusz Korczak.
There you go. Who was a Polish Jewish pediatrician, educator, children's author, teacher. I mean, he's just one of these people who kind of defies any sort of compartmentalization. Um, and I couldn't possibly do justice to his life in this comment, but one of the things that he did as someone deeply committed to children's welfare, and he actually went on to be killed with a group of children that he stayed with, I believe, who were being sent away during the Holocaust to a death camp. And he also involved children as cultural producers. There was a kind of newspaper-based set of activities that were both for, but then also soliciting input from children. So I think that like single people can really make a difference, and they can have these legacies, not just in terms of the people they're able to touch directly, but like in getting new ways of thinking, and setting some precedents, and just showing how rich actually engaging with children more laterally can be. But there are a bunch of other examples. I mean, my own work is in South Africa, so there were a lot of workshops during the apartheid years, organized by activists, where children would be invited to produce artworks that were then taken around the world and exhibited, and very effectively helped to raise money for anti-apartheid activists. So I think that there are a bunch of things that could be said about the power of children's expressions, because children are, as much of as they're denigrated, they also are cherished, and they're valued, and there's a lot of anxiety around children, and making sure that the children are okay. So that maybe leads into your second question around COVID. And so I think that is a period where a lot of things kind of aligned. So there were some very pressing needs, like kids were at home, parents were incredibly stretched and at a complete loss as they tried in many cases to grapple with their responsibilities and their work and caregiving while children were at home. And museums were similarly hard pressed because they were closed, and facing lots of huge problems about their futures, and had people on staff. So it was like, what can we do? So they really tried to fill in some of those gaps with what was happening with limited access to other public sites. So yeah, I think that necessity can breed invention in some powerful ways. I think looking at the COVID period and how museums sort of recognized that children should be paid attention to is quite instructive. I think also the unprecedentedness, or the way that it was narrated as such, of that pandemic made people think about the current moment as future history in a way that made us maybe more aware than usual that children's perspectives should be a part of that history. Those are just some thoughts. Rebecca might have some other things to say.
Yeah, I think I can also speak to that from my own research in a Canadian perspective. And like what Monica was saying earlier, some of this work around children's museology might seem new and radical, but a lot of what I've been trying to do in my research is like peeling that back and finding more historical examples of when this type of work has been done. So I've been looking to the Canadian Museum of History, and specifically in 1989, so right around the time of when the UNCRC was introduced. So in this pivotal moment when people were thinking about children's rights, they had a nationwide co-curated exhibit with young people, where young people were sent in like storybooks about family treasures, and then a specific group of them got together to curate those family treasures in a big space in the museum. And that project happened, I think, 2 other times as well. And so sometimes it seems like a lot of these projects do happen like in certain moments. So in these watershed moments when people are thinking about children and their rights, and also like by certain individuals. So Monica and I also have a piece about how children are represented in the Canadian Museum of History in the Canada History Hall. Um, and a lot of that representation falls into like a specific part of that exhibit in Gallery 3 that happened to be curated by someone who happens to have a PhD in the history of childhood. So you can really start to see kind of like people's own interests, their own passions shine through in a lot of these projects. And some of that I think is helpful in thinking about like, okay, sometimes you do need to kind of persuade people to take a project like this that's child-centered more seriously. And any project that a museum is putting on, you need to be persuading people that it's worthy and worth the money and what have you. But sometimes aligning some of those projects with moments that might be kind of like aligned with things that are happening in the world or anniversaries of things. So there are always anniversaries of the United Nations Declaration Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are always anniversaries on things that young people were involved in. I found that like even when I worked at the Canadian Museum of History, we would kind of always try to center things around events and moments, and that can be very persuasive for some people.
Thanks so much. I've got to go to another meeting, but this was great. Thank you very much.
I saw Megan had your hand up. I know we're coming to the end of our time here, but Megan, would you like to jump in?
I think it's okay. I was going to make a comment, but I realized that Rebecca had just summarized something so beautifully, and I didn't want to kind of make the last comment my comment. So I will refrain. Thank you.
Okay, well, I wish that we had more time together, and I hope that our conversations can continue. I feel like some good connections have been made here. I've learned a lot. We will be following up with the survey that will go out maybe to everyone who registered, but just know that we are really interested in connecting and trying to move forward in this work. And we're always happy to learn of new projects, to collaborate. And I hope that you all got something out of this, and we certainly got a lot out of hearing from you. Rebecca, would you like to close us with any final comments?
No, this was wonderful, and it was really great talking to everyone in the breakout rooms and then afterwards. And the Google Doc that we shared isn't going anywhere. So if it's ever something that's like helpful for you to draw on from either examples or inspirations, or to talk through some of the challenges that were identified, like you'll always have access to that document. And like Monica said, we'll be sending out a survey to see if there are any other connections that we can make moving forward.
All right, so a few more links there in the chat, but we will wish you a good day and take care.